All right, so today what we're going to do is we are going to talk about the causes of World War II in Europe and in Asia. Now, unlike World War I, which had this really kind of complex Rube Goldberg's machine of causes, the causes of World War II are actually pretty simple. It's really German aggression over in Europe and then Japanese aggression over in Asia. But let's look a little bit more closely at it because it is a little bit more complex than it appears on the tin. All right. So we'll start with Europe. So Hitler actually came into power intending to go to war. And he said as much in that manifesto that he wrote after that initial coup attempt, the Beer Hall Putsch. And remember that manifesto is called Mein Kampf. And he basically said, I want to go to war. That is my goal here. Well, what did he want? He wanted territory. And well, why did he want that? So again, kind of like what actually European countries have been doing for quite a while, he believed that territory would make Germany great. So in order to sort of maintain its or regain its status as a great power, I guess you could say. Hitler believed that Germany needed to gain the land that it lost after the Treaty of Versailles, as well as gain new land that Germany had never really held. So he subscribed to this idea called Lebensraum, or living space. So he believed, yeah, Germany just needed more land, they needed more territory. So Hitler was also especially interested in invading the USSR. And part of that was, again, he wanted territory, and there's some really good resource-rich territory in Eastern Europe on the western fringes of the USSR. But he also subscribed to this theory called Judeo-Bolshevism. Basically, he believed that all Jews were communists, therefore the government of the Soviet Union must be communist, therefore he should invade it. He was wrong, by the way. Stalin, definitely not Jewish. Stalin, also not really a big fan of Jewish people. So Hitler was wrong about that one, but he was wrong about many things, so that's that. But Hitler had some obstacles. Well, one of the big ones was itself the Treaty of Versailles, right? So the Treaty of Versailles put strict limits on the size of Germany's military. It demilitarized parts of Germany. So what Hitler had to do basically was figure out a way to remilitarize Germany without arousing the suspicions of Britain and France, right? So how is he going to do that? So when he first came to power, so remember he's in power about early 1933 or so from then on. So in the early 1930s, Hitler pursued this relatively low-key foreign policy. Like he wasn't super aggressive, and he really tried to convince Britain and France that he was kind of like this peaceful leader. He wasn't going to go start another war again. And basically, he just wanted to kind of stay on the down low and not gain any suspicion. All right. But he did want to rearm Germany, right? We know that that's part of his priority, right? So what's he going to do? So in about the mid-1930s, Hitler started to kind of take those first steps, kind of started to dip his toe into the water, and he started to build up Germany's military. So he added an air force, he instituted a draft, which expanded the size of Germany's military, and he also sent troops to the Rhineland, which is this region of Germany that had been demilitarized by the Treaty of Versailles. It's Western Germany, so France, right? That was what France wanted. They wanted sort of this buffer zone, and now Hitler's starting to put troops in that buffer zone. Now, what did Britain and France do? Absolutely nothing. They kind of wagged their fingers at Germany and they're like, hey, stop that. That's in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. But they didn't really do any, actually impose any punishment or anything like that, right? And well, why is that? So Britain at this time was practicing this policy called appeasement, which kind of based on the assignments that I've seen you do in Mr. Moss's class, I'm guessing you might know a little bit about. Basically what this was they wanted to give Hitler what he wanted in the hopes of maintaining the peace, right? So kind of the analogy I always think of here is like, you've got you're babysitting your little sibling and they're crying and they're causing all this noise. And you're like, oh, I just want them to be quiet, right? Well, what do they want? I don't know. Give them some food, give them a toy. I don't know. What'll shut them up, right? That's kind of what Britain and France are doing. And it's really easy in hindsight to judge them for this. But consider the devastation of World War I. They were doing this for a reason, right? They wanted to avoid another war. They did not want World War I to happen again, right? And they're like, well, why don't we just try and calm the situation down? Now, did they do this in a very smart way? No, absolutely not, right? But you can see the motivations here. Now, Hitler's actions, so this remilitarization, right, and then Britain and France's total failure to respond, what it did is it showed that the Treaty of Versailles just really didn't mean anything, right? Like, why have this document if you're not going to enforce it? So what that did is it really emboldened Hitler, and he was ready to take the next steps. All right, so he starts to push the boundaries a little more. And he's going to annex some territory. So in 1937, he annexes Austria. And again, Britain and France do nothing. And you're like, well, okay, well, why is this, right? Well, part of it, again, it's that policy of appeasement, but there's something more to this, right? So remember, Hitler himself is Austrian. And we didn't talk about this when we talked about German unification, but there was actually a plan among some Austrians to unite with Germany. Remember, there was the Austro-Prussian War that kind of dashed that hope. But there were some German nationalists who were like, why don't we do like a super Germany? and actually what was called Grossdeutsch, Big Germany, with Germany and Austria both attached, right? So this was a thing. People had this idea before. So Britain and France were like, they're all Germans. What does it matter, right? And this picture here, by the way, they did hold an election about this annexation, which is called the Anschluss. You don't need to know that word. Your textbook doesn't use it for some reason, but do know that the annexation of Austria. They did hold a ballot. And what I really like about this is because it's asking, like, do you Austrians want to unite with Germany and Adolf Hitler? And you can see the no bubble is really tiny and the yes bubble is really big. Like, I love that the ballot explicitly tells you which bubble to fill in. Wow. So that just, by the way, highlights, we talked about totalitarianism last time. Totalitarian states do hold elections, but boy, are they shams, right? So Hitler annexes Austria, Britain and France do nothing, right? Hitler's like, great, awesome, next steps. Okay, well, I'm going to look at Czechoslovakia now. Now, this was a bit more of a problem for Hitler because Czechoslovakia had this pact with France. So theoretically, France was going to help Czechoslovakia out if anything happened to Czechoslovakia. So Hitler, basically, he walks over to Czechoslovakia, or diplomats do, and he says, hey, give me the Sudetenland. And the Sudetenland was this region of Czechoslovakia. It had a lot of German speakers, so Hitler was like, that is rightfully German territory, so give it to us. And Czechoslovakia's like, I don't know how I feel about this. And then Britain and France are like, I don't know how I feel about this either. So they organize this thing called the Munich Conference. And basically what they're doing is they're like, should we give the Sudetenland to Hitler, right? And what did they decide to do? They give the Sudetenland to Hitler. So continuing to practice appeasement. I think your textbook even calls it like the high point of appeasement or something like that. So that's why this thing is significant, excuse me. So Hitler, he occupies Czechia, which is the Czech part of Czechoslovakia. And then he actually lets Slovakia as independent, but they're kind of like this puppet state. And that's something that we'll actually see several times with Nazi Germany. They say, oh, well, this state is independent, but they're kind of under the thumb of the Nazis at the same time. All right. Then Hitler decides he's going to take one more step, and he starts to do kind of the same thing with Poland now. So he starts to agitate. He's like, all right, Poland, I don't want all of Poland, but it would be really nice if you could give us the city of Gdansk, because that's ours. If you would have called it Danzig, that's what they called it in German. So this previously German city, he's like, why don't you give it back to us? And Poland is like, I don't know how I feel about it, right? So Britain at this point is starting to get wise to Germany's pattern, right? They're like, okay, so he starts demanding this small piece of territory, and then he seizes the whole pie, right? So Britain promises to Poland that they're like, hey, I will protect you if Germany invades you, right? So we hope they actually make good on this promise. So France did not do that to Czechoslovakia. So let's see if Britain makes good on it, right? So Britain and France are also like, okay, they're starting to get a little worried now. And they're like, well, why don't we, like, we on our own, maybe we don't want to go to war quite yet. We need some help. We need some backup. And so they start looking at the USSR, right? And the USSR, by the way, so we mentioned, right, they're doing really well. So Britain and France are struggling not just with the after effects of World War I, they're struggling with the Great Depression. The USSR is doing fine, right? Their economy is doing great. Those 5-year plans are paying off. So Britain and France realize this is a really important military ally, but they're kind of unwilling to make an alliance with communists. So there's some anxiety there. Now Hitler sees this happening and he's like, oh, shoot, I should make an alliance with the USSR. That will prevent them from attacking me, right? So he kind of swoops in and he makes his own non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. Now, if you're following this, right, so he wrote in Mein Kampf, I want to invade the Soviet Union because they are inferior human beings, right? He writes that. And then he comes in, he makes this non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. And Stalin is like, great, love it, absolutely, definitely. Does this pact last very long? No, it does not. But that's next time, right? So I just want to share this lovely political cartoon illustrating the non-aggression pact between the Nazis and the Soviets. I don't know why Stalin gets to be the bride, but he makes a very lovely bride. All right, so by the way, this pact is sometimes called the Hitler-Stalin Pact or the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Again, I don't know why your textbook doesn't name it. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that's for the foreign ministers of each country. So Hitler-Stalin Pact, we'll call it that, that works. Now, not only was this a non-aggression pact, there was also a secret provision that basically said that the Soviet Union and Germany were going to go halvesies on Poland. So Germany would get the West, Stalin would get the East, and then Stalin would also get some other parts of Eastern Europe that they lost in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So after the Civil War, that treaty that they signed with Germany. So they make good on this treaty. In September, Hitler invades Poland, and then Stalin invades Poland as well. So in response, Britain and France are like, oh, shoot, this is actually a problem now. So they declare war on Germany, and World War II has officially kicked off in Europe. Now, however, there's a whole thing going on in Asia that we haven't talked about. And some historians will actually say, so by the way, that invasion of Poland was in September 1939. We're going to kind of go back a little bit. We're going to look at what Japan's been doing in Asia in the early 1930s and mid 1930s. And some historians will actually argue that we should actually start the clock for World War II with Japan's invasion of Manchuria in the early 30s. So maybe a little Eurocentric to start it in 1939, but this is AP Euro, so I guess we're starting in 1939. All right, so let's talk about what's going on in Asia, right? So we need to do some contextualization about Japan, right? So at the end of World War I, Japan actually got a lot of Germany's colonies over in Asia and the Pacific, so it was a big win for them. So in the early 30s, the Japanese Empire included Korea and Taiwan, and then several islands in the Pacific, so quite a bit of territory. Now, in 1931, Japan decides to invade Manchuria, and that actually draws a lot of international condemnation, and it leads Japan to withdraw from the League of Nations, which I did not capitalize for some reason. I will fix that. And why did this happen? So Japan is super nationalistic right now. Their government's pretty much controlled by right-wing nationalists and military leaders, and their whole shtick is like, we've known they want to be kind of part of the kind of, I say, eat at the big kids table. They want to be this big imperial power over in the East. We've known they wanted that for a long time, right? And that's just ratcheted up in the early 1930s. But they've also got some economic motives here as well. So Japan's population had grown really substantially. That put a lot of pressure on resources, so they really need natural resources. And then kind of adding to that, Japan had been hit really hard by the Great Depression because they really relied on exports. So they manufactured stuff in Japan, they sold it over to the rest of the world, and a lot of the rest of the world decided to try and protect their own industries by issuing tariffs. So Japan is basically, they can't export anything, they need natural resources, the population is growing, they're in a bind, and they've decided that the only way they can solve this bind is by basically invading mainland Asia and colonizing it. All right, so Japan kind of like what was going on in Europe, like Hitler's pushing boundaries, he starts to go into Eastern Europe, right? Japan starts to push boundaries in the same way, but over in China. So after seizing Manchuria, Japan goes to China, and the nationalist leader of China at this point, Chiang Kai-shek, he kind of practices his own version of appeasement, and he's like, oh shoot, Japan's invading. Well, I guess I'll try and protect the rest of China. I'll just throw him a bone, I'll give him northern China. Japan is like, no, not satisfied though. And they start to push further and further south. He sees the capital of China at this point, which is Nanjing, and they brutally massacre the civilian population. Like, it is unbelievably horrific. Like, it used to be called, or the city used to be called Nanking, and usually people will say Nanking Massacre or Nanjing Massacre, but people also call it the Rape of Nanjing, which really gives you a sense of how bad it was. And here's just a statue memorializing that. So Japan's pushing further and further into China. And kind of like, again, what Germany was doing over in Europe, Japan starts to look at potential alliances. So they actually considered an alliance with Germany. We know that they will eventually have an alliance with Germany. And part of the reason why that was because they wanted to kind of go with Germany and invade the USSR, because they knew that Germany wanted to do that. Because apparently Stalin didn't read Mein Kampf, but Japan did. And Japan wanted to kind of carve off pieces of territory in the eastern part of the Soviet Union. So they wanted parts of Siberia. God knows why would you want Siberia, but whatever. But of course, when the Nazis make the Nazi-Soviet pact or the Hitler-Stalin pact, Japan is like, oh boy, I guess that's not going to work out then. So Japan kind of turns its attention away from the USSR and starts to look south towards Southeast Asia and the Pacific. But they realize that expansion into those areas was going to bring conflict with the imperial powers that controlled them, Britain and France, as well as the United States.